My name is Sim and this is a beginner's video for those who are interested in starting cold exposure. I know there's many different ways to skin a cat and this is my personal preferred method and how I guide clients through the cold exposure myself. So in this video, I'll take you through a very accessible approach that will bring you closer to your first dip. For a beginner, each step will give you a stepping stone you need to get started without the dread that comes with going into the cold water. And then at the end of the video, I'll give you some do's, don'ts, and a checklist. I know that for most people, the thought of exposing themselves to the cold is grueling and it creates a lot of resistance. And while I understand where it comes from, it's also often neglected and overlooked that your body has the ability to adapt to the cold through cold thermogenesis. So thermogenesis is the word for creating heat. And the mechanic by which this happened is the epigenetics that have to do with the cold shock protein. So just like we have heat shock proteins, we have cold shock proteins that when we get into the cold activate and allow us to come back stronger or more adapted to the stimulus, the stress from the cold. As soon as those proteins are activated, we will start becoming more efficient at tolerating cold. As an organism, we're far more robust than we're made out to be. Hence why I said before that a lot of people have a far greater mental resistance, or they think about it in ways that are resistant to doing it, rather than a physiological resistance. Even though you might experience it as one, like, oh, I don't want to go in. It's not because you can't. It's just physiologically, meaning like the body can take it. It's rather that we are psychologically not prepared to deal with it. So what happens is that we as an organism, with all these mechanisms in our epigenetics that deal with the heat shock proteins and the cold shock proteins, is that we're super robust, resilient, and even anti-fragile. So anti-fragile is a term of Nassim Taleb, which is a concept that he termed that basically means to grow or thrive from chaos and disorder. And when you think about it, the chaos or the disorder in this case is the stressor that we experience from going into really cold temperatures, right? So either into the water or into the sauna when we think about heat. In this case, entering the cold is chaos. And I'm sure from all of you listening or watching, and especially from people that have done it or clients that do it with me, they will most certainly agree with that. So the supercompensation from the initial shock is the signal for us to adapt and grow stronger, which makes us anti-fragile as time goes on, right? So you get stronger and stronger and stronger as you build up your exposure to this stressor. For those among you that want to do cold exposure but can't even stand the idea of cold water, a really accessible drill is to just splash cold water in your face. So the colder, the better in this case. I understand that for a lot of people, it might not even register on the scale of like, well, it's not really, that cold or even like that big of a deal, but already exposing your face to cold water will start signaling these epigenetics to start creating a change and to actually activate the mammalian dive reflex, which lowers your heart rate, which would effectively prepare us to go dive. So you can consider doing 20 to splashes either in one go, or you can do several rounds of 10 throughout the day just to get used to the cold water in your hands and in your face. The next step would be to start conditioning your extremities, so everything away from the core, which is in this case your hands and your feet, and they're the most susceptible to temperature changes. They're kind of your thermometers, right? Natural or biological thermometers. They're really good at sensing any type of change in heat and cold because of the amount of small nerves that run through your extremities. So when it gets really cold, the body will try to shut off a lot of the blood flow towards the extremities, so your feet and your hands, to try to save the blood flow and the heat for your core, to make sure that your vital organs are functioning optimally, and which is maintaining the homeostasis. One of the greatest barriers for people going into cold water or even thinking about cold water is the numbness that accompanies the swim or the dip because of the cold, because of these blood vessels basically squeezing shut, and the blood flow and the heat being sent to your core. We can train up these small blood vessels by soaking our hands and our feet in cold water. It won't really stop the constriction of these blood vessels per se, but it will make you better able to tolerate the cold in your extremities and work through the numbness. In advanced stages, some people are better at keeping those capillaries, the really small blood vessels in the hands and the feet, open. But of course, like, there's a physiological reason as to why they would be closing in the first place. But as soon as you get more used to it, it's gonna form less of a barrier for you. In this case, when you soak your hands and your feet, you can do it in a room at room temperature, and you can have a foot bath or a small bucket in which you put in your feet or your hands, not at the same time. And then you can start off with the coldest water you can, and as you want to challenge yourself more, you can add some ice to it. When you've worked your way through step 1 and step 2, then it's time to graduate to the contrast shower. A contrast shower is where you start off with the warm shower on whichever setting you want, and you gradually go colder. For most people starting off, that's enough, where they just go gradually colder and you work your way through the cold, and as soon as you stop being able to tolerate it, you go back to warm. Once you've become more comfortable, you can start warm and end on cold, and you can still make it as gradual as possible, or turn up the speed as to which makes the cold water get colder. You can stick with the contrast as long as you feel you need to, and when you're ready, you can transition into starting with cold showers at a colder temperature. So this doesn't necessarily mean you need to put it on freezing cold. It can just mean that if it's somewhere around 15 degrees Celsius, you can start there, which is already a 20 to 22 degree difference from your body temperature, and you work your way to only sticking into the cold shower at that temperature. And then gradually you make the shower colder and colder until it's at its coldest. And then from there, you also start building time. The time frames are all up to you. To make it as accessible as possible, I would start off with, if you're starting with cold only, maybe start with just 10 seconds and try to improve on your time every time you do it. So you can jump with 5 seconds, you can jump with 10 seconds, whatever you feel is the most comfortable, because the idea is to be able to be consistent, maybe do it every morning or every evening, and build up your cold tolerance this way. I found it to be a great way to wake up in the morning, and it's definitely a good substitute for coffee.
It's I think it's minus 10 degrees Celsius. There's generally around 4 degrees Celsius. February so far has been the coldest, I guess, and basically the entire way through. So yeah, today the aim is just to show you the entry and like some tips on preparation and post swim. So that's the plan. So this is swim home. This is our swimming spot in general. So me and my clients, we come here every week. We have our cold exposure. This is the Oslo Fjord. Oslo is where I live. This is our weekly view. It's one of my favorite spots in the city. So it's awesome that we can swim here. For entry, a few good tips is mat. It's something that, especially when there's ice like there is here, that will protect the feet. A surf poncho. I got this one from North Port. It's a great investment when it's minus 10 or minus 12 outside. So I have gloves with me as well. I have a big jacket. But as far as when it comes to major tips about getting in, is undress quickly and get everything done. instead of building up mental resistance to the swim, to the dip. Right, so enough talking. Let's go. Swim coming out. Still try to keep breathing. Generally, people tend to walk up, stop their breathing, or breathe really shallow, and then makes the thermogenesis production much harder. So try to relax.
The final step in this video is the cold plunge. The same type of thinking applies. We start off with a low threshold time, so there is no reason to start projecting yourself forwards like, oh, I need to do X amount of time. It's just a matter of getting in and coming out as a beginner. You can even, if there's a ladder, you can hold on to the ladder. If you're sitting down, if it's shallow enough, you can keep your hands outside of the water. So there's a lot of options as to how you can go about it. But the main thing is that time in the beginning shouldn't be a factor. It's only once you start getting more comfortable, then you can start increasing the time. So the first thing you want to notice or be aware of is intensity. Each day will vary because cold thermogenesis, so your ability to create heat, is based on a lot of different things, a lot of different parameters, which is sleep, nutrition, and your stress level. So throughout the day, throughout the week. So as with one other factor with why I don't overly focus on time is that as conditions get colder, you might not be able to keep the same time, and then you start creating this type of a mini failure loop where you're like, oh, last time I did X amount of time, now only did this much. But if it gets colder and the intensity goes up, it means that it's harder, ergo you can't stay for the same amount of time. So I think measuring intensity is a much better way to go about it. And if it gets really intense, if it gets really cold outside, in here in Oslo we've had -12 and the water lately has been 2.5 degrees Celsius, then it's good to wear a hat because the head loses a lot of heat. So the main thing next to intensity is to use your breath as a tool to measure, right? I use it as the most important checkpoint with my clients and anyone that I either guide through swimming or that comes swim with us in the fjord, because in the end it will dictate how you bridge the cold shock response. The cold shock response is that initial shock that you get from the cold that either catches people's breath from the beginning where they lock everything up, or they start hyperventilating. The best way to think about it, in my opinion, is to start with keeping an even breathing rhythm before your entry. So already when undressing, think about keeping your breathing even, and as you're about to enter, try to get into a rhythmic breathing that is nasal. As the stress goes up, people tend to get carried away with the stress breathing, which is the hyperventilation. Attempt to try to keep it controlled and nasal, even though that's gonna be the hardest thing in the beginning. So even before you think about tracking time or anything else, you want to work on controlling your breathing to bridge that cold shock response. For many, regulating breath is the hardest checkpoint by far, because it's a very different experience to be in there with relaxed breathing than hyperventilation and being extremely stressed out, even if you stayed for the same amount of time. By being mindful of your breathing, you'll gradually build up more control, go a long way in your ability to tolerate the cold. Another important factor is to keep your breathing even when you come out. What I see in a lot of cases is that people come out from wherever they're swimming, and that they start reverting to the shallow stress breathing. Most of the time they don't go into hyperventilation, But because they're so focused on getting all their clothes on, which is important of course, they lose track of their breathing and it just makes them feel colder and colder. So try to keep your breathing even and controlled even as you're dressing, so you can help create the heat which needs oxygen. As far as do's and don'ts go, definitely do prep. So just follow the checklist I will follow. Keep breathing, so keep focusing on controlled breathing. Feel out the intensity. Don'ts: hyperventilating or hypoxic breathing, or any type of breathing practice that will make you lightheaded and makes you maybe pass out, or constantly trying to push the time. As far as the prep goes, make sure you come with a few towels, gloves, hats, something to stand on. It's a great investment to have a beach poncho, which I use from Northcore, and I will put this in the checklist. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, like it. If you want to leave a comment and share this with people that you think it will be beneficial for.